The secret love of a soldier, hidden behind enemy lines. Every subscription is like a love letter to these forgotten stories. Thank you for being here. The autumn rain of 1943 fell like tears across the cobblestones of occupied Lyon, each drop carrying with it the weight of a city under siege. Captain James Mitchell pressed his back against the cold brick wall of the narrow alley, his breath forming small clouds in the October air as he listened for the sound of German patrols. 3 months he had been hiding in this labyrinth of shadows and secrets. 3 months since his reconnaissance plane had been shot down over the French countryside. 3 months since he had become a ghost, haunting the edges of enemy territory. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man trained to observe from above now lived his life looking over his shoulder, moving through the underground tunnels of the French resistance like a mole seeking light. But it was in this darkness that he had found something he never expected to discover in the midst of war, a reason to fight for more than just duty and country. Her name was Marguerite Dubois, though she went by Marie in the safe houses and Sylvie when passing messages to other resistance cells. She was a schoolteacher by day, her classroom filled with children whose fathers had been taken as forced laborers, whose older brothers had disappeared into the forests to join the Maquis. By night, she became something else entirely. A courier for the resistance, her bicycle wheels spinning through streets slick with rain and danger, carrying coded messages that could mean the difference between life and death for Allied pilots like James. The first time he saw her, she was standing in the doorway of the abandoned bakery that served as one of their meeting points, her dark hair pinned back in a practical chignon that couldn't quite contain the rebellious curls that framed her face. She wore a simple grey coat, mended at the elbows with careful stitches, and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength forged in fire. When she spoke, her English was accented but precise, learned from books and British radio broadcasts received in secret. "You are the American pilot," she had said, not a question, but a statement of fact delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to identify a species of bird. "Captain Mitchell, yes, I am to help you reach the Spanish border." But the Spanish border had seemed impossibly far away that first night, and now, 3 months later, it felt like a different lifetime. The original plan to move him south had been complicated by increased German patrols, by betrayals within other resistance cells, by the simple reality that moving one American pilot across hundreds of miles of occupied territory required patience, planning, and no small amount of luck. During those long weeks of waiting, hidden in the basement of Marie's apartment building or in the back room of a sympathetic merchant's shop, James had discovered that war could strip away everything except what truly mattered. He had been raised in the comfort of a middle-class Chicago home, educated at Northwestern University, trained as a pilot in the clear skies over Texas. Nothing in his 26 years had prepared him for the intimacy of survival, for the way shared danger could forge connections deeper than years of ordinary conversation. Marie would arrive each evening after her teaching duties, sometimes carrying a thermos of weak coffee made from chicory, sometimes with news from other resistance networks, always with that careful composure that never quite hid the worry in her dark eyes. They would sit at the small wooden table in whatever safe house was sheltering him that week, and she would help him practice his French while he taught her American slang that made her laugh despite everything. "Your pronunciation of the R sound is terrible," she would tell him with a smile that transformed her serious face into something luminous. "You sound like you have rocks in your throat." "Well, yours sounds like you're spitting," he would counter, delighting in the way her cheeks would color slightly at the teasing. These moments of lightness were precious things in a world gone dark, small flames of humanity that burned bright against the encroaching shadows of war. James found himself looking forward to her arrivals with an anticipation that had nothing to do with escape plans or resistance operations. He began to notice details he had no business noticing, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating, the particular shade of brown her eyes became in candlelight, the unconscious grace with which she moved, even when exhausted. It was dangerous, this growing attachment, and they both knew it. Emotions were luxuries that could get people killed in occupied territory. Focus had to remain sharp, decisions clear, survival paramount. But the human heart, James was learning, followed no military protocol. The realization came to him one evening in late November as they sat reviewing escape routes by the light of a single candle. Marie had been explaining the risks of various mountain passes when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence, her finger tracing the pencil lines on the hand-drawn map. Outside, the wind was howling through the streets, carrying with it the first promise of winter. "What is it?" he asked, noting the change in her expression. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the map, but clearly seeing something else entirely. When she finally looked up, there was a vulnerability in her gaze that she usually kept carefully hidden. "My brother Henry," she said softly. "He was a pilot too, shot down over Germany in 1940. Sometimes, when I look at you, I think about what his last moments might have been like, whether he was frightened, whether he thought of home." James reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her skin was cold, but she didn't pull away. "He was probably thinking of you," James said, "of your family, of the things worth fighting for." "And what do you think of?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The honest answer was that he thought of her. He thought of her courage, her determination, the way she risked her life daily for strangers like him. He thought of her students, how she must balance teaching them history while living through it, how she maintained hope in the face of occupation. He thought of her smile, rare but radiant, and how it had become the brightest part of his days. But saying such things aloud would cross a line they had both been carefully avoiding. So instead, he squeezed her hand gently and said, "I think about home, about the future, about the world we're fighting to protect." She nodded, understanding everything he hadn't said, and in that moment of recognition something shifted between them. The pretense of maintaining emotional distance began to crumble like walls under bombardment. December brought snow and increased danger. German security forces, frustrated by resistance activities throughout the region, had begun conducting random house-to-house searches. The network of safe houses was compromised, leaving James with fewer options and Marie with increasingly difficult decisions about his continued concealment. On a particularly cold night, as they huddled together in the cellar of an abandoned church, sharing warmth and a meager meal of bread and preserved vegetables, Marie finally voiced what they had both been thinking. "You cannot stay much longer," she said, her breath visible in the frigid air. "The searches are getting more frequent. Sooner or later they will find you." "I know," he replied, though the admission felt like swallowing glass. "What are the options?" "There is a group leaving for Switzerland next week. It will be dangerous, a winter crossing of the Alps, but it may be your best chance. Switzerland. Safety. An end to the constant fear, the narrow escapes, the life lived in shadows. It should have filled him with relief, but instead, James felt only a hollow ache at the thought of leaving Marie behind. "Will you come with me?" he asked, knowing even as he spoke that it was an impossible request. She shook her head, a sad smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "This is my home, James. My students need me. The resistance needs me. I cannot abandon them. Then I'll stay." "No." Her voice was firm, brooking no argument. "You have a duty to return to your unit, to continue fighting this war, and I have a duty to help you do that." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like incense in the cold air. Finally, Marie spoke again, her voice softer now, more vulnerable. "If the war had never happened," she said, "if we had met in ordinary circumstances, in peacetime, do you think—" She didn't finish the question, but James understood. In peacetime there might have been courtship, letters exchanged across an ocean, perhaps visits and promises and all the traditional rituals of romance. There might have been time to explore what lay between them without the constant specter of death and separation. "I think," he said carefully, "that some connections transcend circumstances. War or peace, I would have fallen in love with you, Marguerite Dubois." The words hung in the air between them, finally spoken, undeniable. Marie's eyes filled with tears that she quickly wiped away. "And I with you," she whispered. They spent that night holding each other, sharing warmth and whispered conversations about dreams and futures that seemed impossibly distant. James told her about Chicago, about the lake in summer and the way snow looked falling past streetlights in winter. Marie spoke of her plans to rebuild the school after the war, of trips she wanted to take, books she wanted to read when such luxuries were possible again. It was a brief respite from reality, a single night when they allowed themselves to imagine a world where love could exist without the shadow of death, where their future might extend beyond the next week, the next day, the next moment of survival. The morning brought harsh reality crashing back. Word came through the resistance network that German forces were conducting a major sweep of the district. The group departure for Switzerland had been moved up by 3 days, leaving barely enough time to reach the rendezvous point in the mountains. Marie moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies and forged documents, arranging for James's transportation to the first stage of his journey. Her professional composure was back in place, but James could see the cost of maintaining it in the tension around her eyes, the careful control of her movements. The last night came too quickly. They met one final time in the ruins of a bombed-out chapel on the outskirts of Lyon, its broken walls open to the star-filled sky. Marie had brought him civilian clothes, French papers identifying him as a deaf-mute laborer, and enough food for several days of mountain travel. "The guide will meet you at dawn near the old mill," she said, her voice steady and professional. "His name is Claude. He will take you to the first checkpoint." James nodded, trying to focus on the practical details while his heart was breaking. "And after that? After that you follow the route we discussed. Stay with the group, keep your head down, and in 10 days you should be in Switzerland." "And you?" Marie looked away, her composure finally showing cracks. "I continue the work here. There are other pilots who will need help, other operations to support." James stepped closer, taking her hands in his. In the moonlight, her face was pale and beautiful, etched with a sadness that mirrored his own. "This isn't goodbye," he said, though they both knew it might be. "When the war is over, I'll come back. I'll find you." "The war changes everything," she replied softly. "We don't know what we'll be when it ends, if it ends." "I know what I'll be," James said with quiet certainty. "I'll be a man who loves Marguerite Dubois, teacher from Lyon, the bravest person I've ever known." They kissed then, finally and desperately, pouring months of suppressed emotion into that single moment of connection. It tasted of tears and promises, of love discovered and love left behind, of all the words they had never spoken and never would. When they broke apart, Marie pressed something into his hands. A small photograph of herself taken before the war, showing her in a summer dress standing in front of her school, surrounded by smiling children. "So you won't forget," she whispered. "Never," he promised, tucking the photo carefully inside his jacket next to his heart. Dawn came grey and cold, bringing with it the sound of Claude's approach through the forest. James had to leave, had to step back into the role of escaping prisoner of war, had to let survival instincts override the desire to stay and fight for the woman he loved. The parting was brief, professional, heartbreaking. Marie maintained her composure until the very last moment, when James was already walking away with the guide. Then she called his name, just once, her voice breaking on the syllables. He turned back to see her standing among the chapel ruins, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears finally flowing freely down her cheeks. The image burned itself into his memory. Marie surrounded by broken stone and winter morning light, beautiful and brave and irrevocably lost to him. The journey to Switzerland was everything Marie had warned it would be. Dangerous, exhausting, fraught with close calls and narrow escapes. James traveled with 6 other evaders, following mountain paths that tested the limits of human endurance. The cold was brutal, the terrain treacherous, the constant fear of discovery, a weight that pressed down on them all. But through it all, James carried Marie's photograph and the memory of her love. In the darkest moments, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, or when German patrols seemed impossibly close, he would touch the photo through his jacket and remember her courage, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was still out there, still fighting, still believing in a future worth struggling toward. He made it to Switzerland, then to England, then eventually back to his unit in the European theatre. The war continued, bloody and relentless. But James fought with a different kind of purpose now. Every mission, every bombing run, every day of survival was a step closer to the end of the conflict, a day closer to the possibility of return. VE Day came in May 1945, bringing with it celebration and relief and the bittersweet knowledge that the fighting in Europe was finally over. James requested leave immediately, using every favor, ode and connection available to secure passage back to France. He had promises to keep, a love to reclaim, a future to discover. Lyon in peacetime was both familiar and strange, scarred by years of occupation but slowly beginning to heal. The streets James had once navigated in secret were now filled with people moving openly in the sunlight. Though the wariness remained in many eyes, the caution born of years when trust could mean death. He found Marie's school first, a modest building on a tree-lined street where children's laughter echoed from open windows. The sight of it, exactly as she had described, filled him with hope and terror in equal measure. What if she had moved on? What if the war had changed her too completely? What if love discovered in extremity couldn't survive the return to ordinary life? But when he knocked on the classroom door and heard her voice call out in French, "Come in," his doubts evaporated. Some things, he realized, were strong enough to survive anything. Marie looked up from her desk where she was correcting papers, her hair now a little shorter, her face bearing the subtle marks of years lived under strain. But her eyes were the same, and when recognition dawned in them, the smile that spread across her features was radiant enough to light the entire room. "James," she whispered, rising from her chair with hands pressed to her heart. "You came back." "I promised I would," he said, stepping into the classroom that smelled of chalk and children and hope. "I told you I'd find you." "And I told you the war changes everything," she replied. But she was crossing the room toward him, moving with the same unconscious grace he remembered. "Not everything," James said, pulling out the photograph she had given him, now worn and creased from months of handling. "Some things survive." Marie laughed then, the sound bubbling up from deep within her like water from a spring. She threw her arms around his neck, and he lifted her off her feet, spinning her once in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the classroom windows. When he set her down, she took his face in her hands, studying the changes the war had wrought. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a gravity to his expression that spoke of battles fought and friends lost. But underneath it all, she found the same man she had fallen in love with, in the shadows of occupied Lyon. "What now?" she asked, though she was smiling as she said it. "Now," James replied, "we have all the time in the world to find out." They were married 6 months later in the same rebuilt chapel where they had said goodbye, surrounded by Marie's students and fellow resistance fighters, by James's fellow airmen who had made the journey to France for the ceremony. The wedding was small but joyful, a celebration not just of their love but of survival, of hope fulfilled, of the victory of the human heart over the machinery of war. They settled in Lyon, where James used his GI Bill benefits to study French literature and history, eventually joining Marie in teaching at the school. Together, they helped educate a generation of children born into war but raised in peace, sharing lessons about courage and sacrifice and the importance of remembering the past while building toward the future. In the evenings, they would sometimes walk through the streets where they had first met, now busy with normal life. Shopkeepers closing their stores, families heading home for dinner, young couples strolling hand in hand. The shadows that had once hidden them were gone, replaced by the ordinary light of peacetime. But they never forgot those dark months when love had bloomed in the most unlikely circumstances, when two hearts had found each other amid the chaos of war. The secret they had shared behind enemy lines became the foundation of a life built in freedom, a testament to the truth that some connections transcend even the most terrible circumstances. Years later, when their own children would ask about the war, about how their parents had met, James and Marie would exchange glances across the dinner table, sharing the particular smile of those who had survived something together, who had discovered that love could flourish even in the darkest places. "It was a different time," Marie would say, her English now flawless after decades of marriage to an American. "A dangerous time," James would add, reaching for her hand. "But also," they would say together, fingers intertwined, "a time when we learned what truly mattered." And in the warmth of their kitchen, surrounded by the laughter of their children and the comfortable quiet of a love that had endured, it was easy to believe that they had been right all along, that some things survive everything, that some connections are strong enough to last forever, and that sometimes in the midst of humanity's darkest hours, the heart finds exactly what it needs to keep hoping for dawn.